My day started with reading emails from comrades in South Africa at one of the universities there, at Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University, about police violence in relation to the Fees Must Fall movement there, where yesterday in Port Elizabeth, South African police services fired stun grenades and used tear gas against student residences in the context of an ongoing struggle for free higher education in South Africa. So to think about those connections between formal locations of education and different kinds of struggles, I think is something that is really important for us to keep in focus in different contexts. What I want to talk a little bit about today is these issues around knowledge production and learning in social movements, in organising. And as Mario pointed out, I mean, yeah, I do have a book that came out last year, but that comes out of about 3 decades of activism. I relatively recently became an academic. I started at McGill in 2008. Prior to that, I'd been an organiser in Aotearoa, New Zealand mainly for a long time without kind of formal educational qualifications, and was always, I think, very much part of the work that I was part of in doing organising. There was always a strong aspect of education, of learning that was taking place, even though very often it wasn't immediately apparent that what we were doing had some kind of educative aspect. And I think some of the work I know Mario yourself has done in relation to union struggles in Colombia and other academics, critical adult education academics like Jane Thompson, Paula Orman, who passed away a few years ago, who are based here in the UK, Griff Foley in Australia, Mike Newman in Australia, other people who have brought forth and talked about understanding, organising and social movement struggles, not just objectifying them as being these things that are about action, but trying to engage with the learning and the knowledge that comes out of those movements, that comes out of ordinary people working together for change, learning, trying to build collectivity wherever they may be. Tomorrow I'm going to be doing a talk in relation to migrant and immigrant worker organising in Montreal and learning in the Immigrant Worker Centre, which I'm involved with. But today I want to sort of put out a few more perhaps general and other kinds of examples maybe to try and have a bit of a conversation and a discussion about this. So yeah, I would argue that essentially some of the most profound understandings about our world emerge out of ordinary people coming together and working for change. And I want to be clear from the outset, I don't have a romanticised idea that knowledge and learning that takes place in social movements or in organising is free of contradictions, or even that it necessarily challenges the status quo. And I think that the understanding the power relations and trying to get a sense of dynamics within communities and within struggles for change is really important. But at the same time, I think if we think about some of the major challenges that face us today, and we think about the knowledge that's being produced and the learning that's taking place in Indigenous people's struggles, holding the line against what's going on, the sort of war against nature, against lands that have been expropriated from Indigenous peoples through colonialism and through contemporary forms of colonisation, whether it's states or corporations. We think about the organised movements of small farmers, fisher people, many of them women, against land, against water grabs, industrial agriculture, the commodification of nature. There's a huge amount of learning that's taking place in there. And I think that one of the things that Griff Foley talks about in his book, Learning in Social Action, that really resonated with me in terms of thinking about my organising background was the ways in which often that learning that takes place in struggles is incidental. It's kind of not something that we necessarily notice until we sort of stand back from it and maybe reflect on it and think, oh, we actually learnt something there. So, for example, I learnt a lot of stuff. I learnt a lot of my politics, stuffing envelopes for different solidarity groups, you know, in a very cold building in Christchurch, where we were essentially a bunch of us getting together, intergenerational, people there who'd been jailed in the Second World War for conscientious objection, people who were, you know, young kids, and we would talk. We were, you know, doing a fundraising thing for, let's say, East Timor solidarity campaigns, but in the process of doing that, or standing over a photocopy machine, making cups of tea, all of those kinds of banal yet necessary things that are the grunt work of organising and building movements, there is learning that takes place, and there's often very profound learning that takes place, and it's not nice and neat and easy to identify, and not even necessarily visible to those of us that are participating in it. So I think, as Robin Kelly, who I think is a really important African American historian, noted in his book Freedom Dreams, that struggles for social change need not only be thought about in terms of whether or not they quote unquote succeeded or not, but as being incubators for ideas that can actually really enrich our analysis of the world and help us to think through in our own lives and locations the possibilities and the ways to change it. And in order to really get a handle on what it actually takes to organise for change, I think we must really take seriously this learning and knowledge production that happens in the intellectual work of daily struggles. As people come together to discuss problems, injustices, debate strategies, and act. And all too easily, I think people's work and actions can get cut up and compartmentalised, and academia can sometimes be very good at doing that or helping that process happen, so that we end up with this idea that educators educate and researchers research and organisers organise and, I don't know, activists do stuff, I don't know. And sort of separating out the intellectual work and the educative aspects of this stuff as if you could cut up the world and people's activities in this kind of way. And so I think when we overlook the fact that everyone has the capacity to learn and to reflect in the course of struggles for change, we end up being left with these very simplistic, almost cliched kind of paint by numbers accounts of movements and activism that focus on great individuals and charismatic leaders and clever slogans, maybe a clever social media use now, professional spokespeople, and often mistakenly attribute the rise of social struggles and movements to, you know, new technologies, etc., without getting at that kind of slower, long-haul work of building relationships, building analysis, challenging each other, trying to find common cause, and so on. Jane Thompson, who I think is a really important British feminist adult educator, back in the 1980s argued that the purpose of knowledge has to be more than an individualistic solution to personal disadvantage. As she puts it, social change, liberation, will be achieved only by collective as distinct to individual responses to oppression. And I also want to just read a little quote from Gabrielle Nadeau-Dubois, who was a spokesperson for one of the major Quebec student unions in 2012 in a book that was originally published in French and translated into English a couple of years ago, where he talked about this notion or this idea that was often circulating in the media, that the mass mobilisations of students in Quebec against tuition hikes was somehow a sort of spontaneous explosion. I don't know, the stars all aligned and something happened and suddenly you had 300,000 people out in the streets of Montreal. And he said, and I quote, "Intellectuals, bloggers and artists joyfully welcomed this unhoped for and so all the more surprising upsurge of anger and political imagination. Too often, the far more humdrum and repetitive mobilisation work that made it all possible, the sort of militant action disdained by many, was overlooked. So no matter what the thrill seekers might say, the strike was not a work of art, a merely expressive event. We were all moved by the beauty, inventiveness and spontaneity of the spring of 2012, but none of it would have been possible without the stubborn efforts of activists who stayed out of the public eye. We may marvel at this phenomenal political moment, but if we ignore the energies that were deployed to bring it about, our praise will be meaningless, and more importantly, we will run the risk of never again experiencing such events. And I think, you know, that in some ways Gabrielle's comment has been, others I think have also sort of echoed a similar concern. Sociologist and activist Gary Kinsman, who's based in Canada, concerned about how some of the radical roots of movements and community resistance get replaced with more respectable liberal versions of history, reminds us of the need to overcome what he calls the social organisation of forgetting. So drawing a curtain over the critical histories of people's struggles, essentially in favour of more simplified versions, is quite consistent in many ways with the kinds of neoliberal tellings of history that privilege individuals' achievements in place of the rich, nuanced, dangerous, difficult, maybe contradictory stories of the struggles of many ordinary people. We can see this, I think, in many cases of looking at the ways that struggles have been reduced to one or two figures, whether we think about the figure of Nelson Mandela in South Africa and not the millions of people who organised the different liberation movements and political tendencies and the ongoing struggles of people in South Africa for justice. And we have a sister who's going to share some of those reflections today. We can also think about how the freedom struggle in South Asia often ended up getting reduced down to Gandhi and Nehru without thinking about the wide range of popular resistance that took place in the freedom struggle there, which often don't get written up and remembered in the same kinds of way. More recently, and we were talking about this at lunch, a bit about the sort of the techno-utopian claims that either the Quebec student strike happened because of social media and it was all organised through Facebook and probably by a spam bot, I think, and that the internet defeated the multilateral agreement on investment, which again invisibilises the fact that there were like thousands and thousands of people doing boring organising work, grunt work, long haul work that often didn't have any immediate payoff, sometimes building on incremental kind of alliances and relationships that have been built through other kinds of networks to organise and to actually essentially put pressure on governments to exploit some of the contradictions that were opening up between governments, etc., etc. So this way in which that kind of work and the knowledge and the education and the learning that takes place in that sort of organising gets rendered invisible. So I think the work of small groups of people battling away and gaining ground, usually in long haul organising, often end up getting edited out of our collective memories. And I tend to agree with Gary Kinsman that process is not just happenstance. I don't think it's just that, that we somehow spontaneously forget that. We have to look at, I think, the ways in which both within movements and also academic and other journalistic or popular treatments of movements render a particular idea about what happened, what it took to bring about the particular changes or so on, why it is that some of that kind of work, that process of organising gets sort of rendered invisible. I also think that the histories of people's struggles for change are repositories of ideas and debates and practices that can offer invaluable conceptual and practical resources. I mean, sure, the extent to which organisers and activists in contemporary social movements, political organisations, communities and popular struggles engage with earlier movement histories, memories and ideas in the course of their organising ranges widely. And often there are resource constraints, there are other competing priorities that mean that activists and movements are not always able to focus on preserving their own histories or passing on and critically engaging with them. When I went for my job interview at McGill, in the preface of this book, I have got a couple of copies for sale, by the way, if anybody's interested, 12 quid. In the preface of this book, I talked about when I went for my job interview at McGill, because I didn't have any qualifications apart from a one-year graduate diploma, I turned up with a wheelie bag, a trundly, what do you call it, these little suitcases full of publications going back into the 80s of stuff that I'd been involved with, like, you know, posters, flyers, newsletters, reports and things like that. And I sort of put it on the table and I said, well, this is what I'd done, this is what I do, this is education. I'm in an education faculty. I was talking to education academics. You know, there's all this knowledge that is here, and there's all of the processes of producing that knowledge that are kind of embodied in the stuff that's on the table. I mean, this is what I do. You know, if you like it, that's cool. If not, you know, have a nice day. And I mean, they gave me a job, so I don't know what it was out of all of that that actually sort of impressed them. But the point is I think that there is, and many of us who have histories in struggles do have plastic bags and kind of falling apart cardboard boxes and things that we've just stuffed in little spare bits of wherever it is that we're living in, or ask a friend to store, which actually often have some really interesting ideas that later on you sort of look back at and you think, oh, that is interesting. You know, we're talking now about, I don't know, struggles around migrant workers and temp agencies, and yet back in the 80s, you know, this organisation was also doing this, or this union were talking about this, and let's have a look and let's sort of see whether there's something in that stuff that maybe we'd forgotten about that might be useful for thinking through today. I think an example in the UK of some work, or two people I think who've done some really interesting work on that, who are both located in universities but also politically engaged people, would be Anandi Ramamurti up in Sheffield, who wrote, I think, a really interesting book called Black Star, Britain's Age and Youth Movements, I think about 3 years ago, came out in Pluto Press, which is a mixture of kind of oral histories and digging into some of that kind of movement literature from the 70s and 80s of the self-defense committees of different kind of anti-imperialist South Asian British youth organisations that were around then. That is kind of a forgotten chapter in history in many tellings of organising here. And also Andrew Flynn, who's at UCL, I think, who does some really interesting work looking at community archives and activist archives and working with communities to find alternative ways to bring forth and preserve and to keep alive some of that kind of archive, that, if you like, and when I say archive, I'm using it in a very broad sense of the word, of all kinds of private and other collections that people may have from earlier involvements in movements. Obviously, this isn't always, you know, this stuff often gets lost. People become disillusioned and throw stuff out. People move offices and homes, internal kind of splits within organisations. State repression in many contexts also factors into the destruction or loss or even recording of such materials. But I think that recovering and recycling relevant ideas and concepts from earlier struggles and the learning that's sort of taken place in there, I think, is really important, and it requires us to be wary of constructing imagined histories and continuities with the past. And we should also, I think, try to avoid formulaically trying to just replicate previous victories. On the other hand, I think we need to be really wary of the tendency to automatically avoid old tactics in new contexts simply because they didn't work in other situations. So I'm really just saying that I think there is a need to perhaps think through and engage I'm not talking about it in a necessarily academic kind of way, with histories of struggle and think about what can be learnt for contemporary organising. I don't think we can afford the costs of historical and social amnesia today for risk of losing the thread and the texture of what it takes to bring about social change and being left with a version of history that glosses over or ignores the significance of behind-the-scenes organising. That kind of amnesia, I think, can paper over the conflicts and the tensions and the power dynamics that have also been part of these organising efforts and from which we can also learn. So E.P. Thompson, an important historian, I think reminds us that ordinary people make their own history. And I think we have to dig into the relationship between the informal incidental learning, the cups of tea and the photocopier machine and the sort of conversations we have on demonstrations. I found it very bizarre working in the Faculty of Education, although predictable in the context I'm in, when during the Quebec student strike I overheard a number of conversations along the lines of, and also in some of the media, the English language media, which was sort of like, if these students don't want to learn, like that's on them. I mean, I don't want to learn this on these protests all the time. Oh, it's kind of interesting because, you know, I went out on these night protests and other protests and there was constant learning going on in there. Like constantly, people are, you know, hooking up, sharing ideas, experiences, talking about all kinds of things. And friends actually in South Africa, a student activist friend just emailed me the other day a thing on his Facebook because I'm a bit too old-fashioned for Facebook or whatever it is, and it sort of said the same thing. He basically just sort of said, oh, you know, they're saying we don't want to learn, but, you know, we have learnt so much in the course of this struggle about state power, about the institutions that people are in, about so many different things. So that kind of informal learning that often happens in the sort of mundane work of organising, I think being brought into dialogue with or being seen alongside the more intentional internal education work that happens in different contexts, that happens in different communities in struggle, whether it's through sort of what we call popular education, whether it's through programmatic political education, and you know, workshops, programs, etc. Griff Foley, who I mentioned earlier, talks about that sort of informal learning and so on as being tacit, embedded in action, and often not recognised as learning. And I think what he also talks about is the capacity of this to generate recognitions which enable people to critique and challenge the existing order. In the book, I talk a little bit about and I'm working on another project at the moment which looks at what people learn about the state through experiences of state repression, surveillance, infiltration, all of those things, and give examples of how within the context of being surveilled or sort of coming up against security, intelligence apparatus, police, etc., people often in that kind of confrontation with the state can undergo profound learning about power. George Smith, who is a sociologist who passed away in the 90s in Canada, who worked closely with Gary Kinsman, who I mentioned earlier, developed a strand of institutional ethnography, which I don't know if folks here might know about as a sort of a socialist feminist research approach, where he looked very closely at, particularly in queer struggles in Ontario, at the role of this confrontation of going up against, going into court over raids on queer spaces in the early 80s, I think, or late 80s, and the sort of the way in which they talked about the sort of conceptual relevancies of the state through these legal processes and coming up against them reveals so much, or can reveal so much about state power, and then figure out from there how you sort of organise against that. So that notion of sort of conflict and confrontation, I think that the organising and the learning, or the ideas that are produced in social movement struggles, shouldn't be romanticised, but many of us underestimate or dismiss the capacity of ordinary people not least those who are deemed to be socially and economically marginalised, to think and to theorise in the course of and in relation to struggles for justice. Some of the ideas that they share take us beyond the common sense horizons of possibility that many of us are asked to accept as being the only way to think. A contemporary example of this, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow, is in the ways in which migrant and immigrant workers with a variety of immigration statuses organise outside of traditional union forms in organisations like the Immigrant Worker Centre in Montreal, which challenge us to rethink where and how working class movements might be reinvented or rebuilt. There's also, I think, a tendency, as Robin Kelly talks about, is to measure the short-term success or visible impact of movements at the expense of appreciating the broader and deeper significance of processes that take so much more time to bear fruit and may not be easy to map. I was reading actually on the plane over, really, I think, a book I'll recommend to folks here, Nick Hildyard from the Corner House, who has a new book out called Licensed Larceny, which has a really nice final chapter, I think, on reflections for activism. And he emphasises in this chapter that there are no kind of formulaic answers to sort of social struggles. There's not a nice, neat package that can be sort of assembled like Meccano anywhere and you know solve the kind of social and environmental injustices that we're dealing with. But he emphasises the importance of building relationships, of building friendships within and among movements, among communities, of where people come together and there's some sort of mutual recognition that maybe there's a possibility that we can actually work together. And I think that those kind of relationships get formed out of daily struggles. They get formed out of the larger systemic change can't happen without those. And it's in those daily local struggles that people build analysis, skills, strategies, confidence, and a base that is needed for longer term, broader change. Paula Allman insists on the significance of these struggles for reform, if you like, and she says whether these struggles pertain to issues emanating from the shop floor, the community, the environment, or any other site where the ramifications of capitalism are experienced, these struggles are some of the most important sites in which critical education can and must take place. Moreover, if this critical education takes place within changed relations, people will be transforming not only their consciousness, but their subjectivity and sensibility as well. So it can be instructive, I think, and sobering to reflect on how ideas and causes that were once viewed as radical or subversive in some contexts, whether it's the right of women to vote and stand for electoral office, can become mainstream, while once mainstream ideas, such as forms of social ownership, are reshaped as being extreme. Claims about some of the apparent newness of some of the contemporary challenges that we face, more recent mobilisations and forms of activism, can sometimes pull us away from thinking deeply about the continuities in the social, political and economic systems within which people struggle. The present day can often be disconnected from its histories, including concepts and lessons from those earlier struggles, in ways that essentially see all collective struggles everywhere as failures, and which openly or implicitly accept that there's no real alternative to capitalism as we lurch from one crisis to another at a planetary level. I think intergenerational learning is really something that many activists, many folks are trying to grapple with, of finding different ways to bridge or to preserve or to engage different generations of struggle in different contexts. And I know for myself, I'm 50 now, and I kind of come out of, I was politicised like many folks during the Cold War, and sort of very much kind of relates to organising traditions that were also about anti-colonial resistance and liberation struggles from that era, and sharing and figuring out how we talk about and bring this sort of learning forth in activist spaces. I'm also, I guess, concerned about what I see as being a sort of a swell of entrepreneurial, individualistic and professional approaches to social change. We could call it perhaps in some senses NGOisation, in some cases, even as the language of community and the collective is invoked, and thinking again about what happens in terms of the sort of relationship between learning and action, and the process is the dialectic, if you like, in terms of learning and acting together, that can form kind of building blocks for movements. I think, again, coming out of the work that I've done and the experience as an activist too, of not glossing over the conflicts within organisations and coalitions committed to working for peace and justice, with people who've routinely ignored or dismissed racism, sexism, colonialism, homophobia as being unrelated to some real issue as defined by dominant groups within these networks, within these movements. And I've seen and experienced how anti-colonial and anti-imperialist perspectives have often been shut down in these spaces. Back in the 90s, we used to organise in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and with comrades in the Asia Pacific against the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, which is a free trade and investment process. There was this sort of flourishing of these parallel people's summits. We were just talking at lunch about the WSF, the World Social Forum too, and by about 96, we were calling these the NGO Olympics. And we were trying to figure out what this was all about, because I was from a group that didn't have a lot of resources and we'd kind of cobbled together money to send somebody to go to some of these meetings because we thought it was important to try and build some relationships with other folks and particularly more critical folks and more grounded folks in the region, and it ended up sort of seeing like a sort of a territorial bun fight often over issues and who had the sort of the right to be the sort of authoritative voice on free trade and investment, and less to do with actually trying to build stuff at the base, build some kind of movement. I think that we shouldn't shy away from understanding and engaging with some of those power dynamics and looking at the internal policing of some of these movements and ideas and how that takes place. But we live in a world full of contradictions, and I think for me it's not about trying to run screaming from contradictions, but to actually try to understand and engage with these and think, well, how can we try and work these through, ideally together, but at least find collectivities that can actually sort of challenge and work against some of those sorts of tendencies. And I want to just, in sort of wrapping up, sort of give a few other, I guess, comments. One is that I think there's been a real way, going back to this notion of compartmentalisation, that people fall into thinking about movement intellectuals, spokespeople and representatives. And I remember years ago having these discussions where people talked about the notion of the brain and the brawn of movements. People said, oh, well, they're the brains because there's these academics or professional NGO people who speak at places like this, like I'm doing now, kind of holding forth and saying, this is the World Trade Organization and this is this, or this is privatisation and this is this, and this is what we should do. And how many movement and NGO networks and activist groups produce the kind of high priesthood of experts, so people who speak and put forward ideas and positions, but who aren't necessarily doing so in tandem with or with accountability to any kind of social base or community base. And one of the consequences of this is that it can divert attention again from the fact that building counterpower, building strong communities, building sort of that base, trying to build that base to bring about change, comes out of ordinary people in struggles who also create knowledge and ideas. And again, examples I'm thinking of this sort of tension playing out being in some of these alternative NGO sort of people's summits, particularly back in the 90s. I'm just thinking of an example now in Vancouver in 1997 where some workers from Thailand, China and Mexico, women workers, were brought to Canada for a human rights tribunal that was organised by a state-supported kind of human rights organisation and a union. And they were put on a panel and each had about 10 minutes where they actually got translation, and they talked about essentially their plight. And then that was how it was organised. They came on, they talked about their conditions, and then they went off, and the rest of it was narrated by Northern Union and NGO folks. And in a breakout meeting the next day, a number of the women were saying, we feel really used. We were interested in coming to this meeting because we're activists, we're organisers, and we wanted to talk with other people. But essentially the only thing that it seems like we've actually been brought here for is to sort of come on, be a bit of a sort of some sort of poor third world women, and here we've got essentially the sort of the northern NGO political platforms that are going to save or make labour conditions better. So those kinds of dynamics, which essentially invisibilise that kind of the knowledge and the sort of the educational work that takes place in building those kind of struggles, again, I think is a huge thing that we need to take seriously for so many reasons. I think also some of the most significant ideas arise from the conflicts and the tensions within larger organising efforts. For example, it's within and at the fringes of coalitions and alliances, sharp analysis and sophisticated understandings have emerged about the role of many NGOs in supporting capitalist interests. Although it is certainly not a given, people often learn far more profoundly about the power and interests of the state through direct confrontation with its security forces than a workshop or a written account could convey. So perhaps then these fabricated separations between roles are less about the division of labour between ideas people and movement activists, but rather reflect the alienation of many ordinary people from their intellectual labour, the ideas and the visions produced in collective action. Is knowledge only valued if it's produced in certain institutional settings by people with particular qualifications or professional status? We might ask this question of social movements and other forms of activism just as we pose it to academia. We can't just assume people don't know anything and need an educational liberator or activist saviour to lead them. There's often a tension between the professionalised actors who speak at the conferences and the workshops and the panel sessions and who write the NGO, community organisation or activist group statements, the policy analysis, documents and critiques, and those who do that grunt work, that mundane organising work. And Alan Sears, who's a sociologist and activist in Toronto, talks about that grunt work as being about sort of building what he calls the infrastructures of dissent, the means through which activists develop political communities capable of learning, communicating and mobilising together. So this kind of division is problematic. Even within many of these networks and organisations, the benefit of learning through doing is so often undervalued and ignored. I get a strong sense of disjuncture when elite forms of knowledge are elevated as expert and authoritative by the same organisations and movements that promote democracy and the equal valuing of different knowledge traditions verbally. As well, those of us who can convincingly talk and write in ways that mesh with academically and other officially sanctioned forms are often reified as experts, whether we know anything or not. This seems to reflect Foley's view that movements and community organising can reproduce status quo power relationships. NGO and activist groups often define issues and themselves in a narrow, compartmentalised way, and in so doing set parameters for campaigns and political action. So just to wrap up, I don't have any kind of like neat recipes or kind of takeaway one-liners for cooking up the social, political and economic conditions for radical learning and knowledge production. power history and context, the specifics of experience, the importance of place are often very important factors or central considerations for this. But as Robin Kelly suggests, it's in the poetics of struggle and lived experience, in the utterances of ordinary folk, in the cultural products of social movements, in the reflections of activists, that we discover the many different cognitive maps of the future of the world not yet born. So I'll wrap it up there and maybe we can have a bit of a conversation and see where it goes. I'll try and at least get to say something to the different questions. Okay, so in relation to Palestine organising, I mean, one of the things that strikes me, and I'm thinking here about the British context, and I think there's been some stuff in the media, maybe I read something, I don't know, in The Guardian about this, but around also remembering, I think the importance of remembering that the kind of attempts to criminalise or vilify Palestine solidarity organising have echoes of what happened in the 80s in relation to the anti-apartheid movement here, where there was, this whole kind of attempts to go, or threats to go after municipalities that were wanting to boycott or divest in relation to South Africa. So there's one thing. I think, to me, one of the answers is that we end up sometimes in a, I don't want to be naive, but I also want to just say that I suppose the chilling effect of these kinds of moves, we can choose to engage with that in different kinds of ways, and we, I think, need to educate and organise around thinking about that it's not a sort of a deterministic kind of thing that if the government says this, that, you know, we have to sort of say, well, we've got to change what we're doing and go in a different kind of direction, and to point to histories where in fact people have stood their ground and continued to do what they, they've needed to do. Because the chilling effect, I think, and I think this has happened, we can see that, I mean, whether we think about during the Cold War era or whether we think about now, post 9/11, for some of us also the risks because of who we are and how we're perceived are also different in terms of what we say and the visibility of our politics and so on. But that we don't just sort of roll over and play dead. In Canada at the moment, there has been a parliamentary statement that has been, has basically vilified and cast the Palestine Solidarity Movement, as essentially being anti-Semitic, kind of terrible, regressive kind of movement that the Canadian government is, trying to say how terrible it is. There hasn't been legislation that has gone through that's actually, criminalising organising or whatever. So I would say, yeah, I mean, that's probably my kind of like, quick kind of response to the question there, is to really, to try and work with, and it's not necessarily a nice, easy, straightforward process for people who are rightly maybe concerned about these kind of things, but to be able to talk through and think through in ways that don't just buy into what the state actually wants, which is for people to not organise and so on. In relation to in relation to your question, Mehmet, I think around the contradictions and learning in knowledge production. I mean, I think yes, there are lots of examples I can sort of think of. I know I was doing a talk yesterday in Nottingham around migrant and immigrant worker organising and talking about some of the experiences and tensions around trade unions in different countries, including in Canada, relating to and supporting migrant and immigrant worker struggles and moving out of a box that sometimes is a very attractive box, it seems, for some people to fall into in a kind of exclusionary kind of nationalism, and thinking again about the sort of the the slow work that often takes place of people at the fringes of, if you like, the labour movement or the fringes of work in society, challenging the ways in which they are perceived through collective organising in things like worker centres and temporary agency workers associations and so on, to try to get at and deal with some of these kinds of, if you like, not so progressive ideas and learning that circulates within what should be, working class organisations that support working class workers, whoever. I think there are lots of examples too within the global justice movement, for example. Some of my experiences and tensions with both New Zealand and Canadian NGOs and unions around the failure of those NGOs and unions in their analysis and understanding about globalisation to talk about colonialism and to look at the histories and the fundamental building blocks of free market capitalism as being deeply embedded in and related to colonial capitalism and what that then meant for their assumptions about what strategies, about campaigns and organising, and how we'd often see strong solidarity movements for struggles in East Timor and in Indonesia, in other parts of the world against corporations, but nobody wanted to talk about the fact that the same oil and gas corporations are on Indigenous territories in Canada or in other countries being facilitated through the same kinds of economic and political policies, that we're talking about being writ large through globalisation. And so again, how do you deal with that? And I mean, those were struggles. I mean, those are struggles that have continued to be fought out. And has there been some progress? Possibly. There has been perhaps some progress at a certain level, but the struggles on the ground remain and might have been so much different in some ways if there had been much clearer solidarity in relationship to the struggles, let's say, of Indigenous peoples in Canada against corporations from unions and from those organisations. What else do we have? We had also, yes, I think that point you raised around learning and leading to organising, I think that there's potential and there's experiences of lots of, I think, ways in which people have come together, whether it's been some sort of informal study groups or other kinds of intentional learning. I'm thinking here too of the role of language classes in relation to migrant and immigrant worker struggles and how you can learn English and French about see, spot, chase the ball, or you can learn English and French about these are the labour laws and these are what your rights are. And from that, I think also building collectivities. I mean, that is in some ways a sort of a building block or an example that comes out of some of the worker centres in North America that I'm a bit familiar with. That sometimes happen, that people do get attracted to an immigrant worker centre or a community organisation because it's actually about learning a language, but through that, people sometimes find common cause and organise and plug into organising that's already happening. In relation to policy and building institutions and influencing the top, I mean, my belief is that things change when when people actually build some kind of counterpower in communities and in mobilisations and create dilemmas for sometimes the state and policy makers. I don't think that, for example, lobbying and coming up with, it would be great if we could just produce, and I think academics can be very good at thinking that if only we dot the I's, dot the T's and cross the I's. If only we do that, and we kind of have all our arguments really kind of well put together and point out how unjust things are, that, you know, those in power will go, oh my God, you know, okay, yeah, we're going to change tomorrow. I think I think history tells us that it is, and I know that it is that work of building some sort of base, building some sort of power, but being able to actually, whatever it is, you know, take the streets or build, you know, just strong communities that are trying to educate and organise in different kinds of ways, that starts to bring about change. And I think we've been again cheated by some of the dominant ways in which we think about history of movements and history of social change, when we don't think about the fact that often it's been small groups of people that people have just said you're just kidding yourselves, you know, relevant is like 6 people at this meeting and so on and so on. And then realising, well, actually, without that small groups of people coming together and all of that kind of stuff, we wouldn't actually have brought about change. Institutions, I don't know. That's a big question. I mean, I would say, you know, it's something that's very much a contextual thing. There are different ways in which I think different places I can think of, or movements or community organisations are trying to, and it's this thing about digging into the history and the sort of activist archive stuff is a conversation a lot of people are having in different places in some ways around thinking, you know, how do we do this more, you know, more sort of intentionally? How do we build this into education, or, you know, informal or more programmatic forms of education within community, in some cases in bigger movements where some of that's sometimes been more systematised. I don't know if there's a nice, neat kind of a solution there. So maybe it's something we can talk about, and if you've got some ideas, because I kind of again think about this tension of institutions and sort of the ways in which there are you know, research or organisations can have some very good, you can have some very good examples, but there are also, I think, a lot of examples of very informal or also invisible kinds of networks that are quite long-standing ones. And I'm thinking here about some of the networks that exist through migration and histories of people's connections to different parts of the world that don't have nice, neat names, and yet are still the kind of building blocks sometimes of when things need to, when things need to happen and need to move. And sometimes that knowledge kind of exists in those kind of networks, but it's not really something we can sort of like, I think, draw a nice, neat diagram and call it an institutional thing. I don't know, you know, maybe some other people have got ideas about that one. I don't.